Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History, the podcast that takes you through the most interesting, important, and yes, controversial events in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. Welcome again. My name is Derek Taylor. I'm your host for this podcast. Once again, thank everyone for listening, for tuning in, as it were. And remember, if you like the podcast, please go and visit us on the web, churchcontroversies.com. I have links to all my episodes, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and elsewhere. I also have links to my articles in places like Crisis Magazine and 1 Peter 5 on my website, as well as some original blog posts, some other material. Also, find me on social media, Facebook page. Please go and like it. Please go to our YouTube channel, where I post podcast episodes as well. Subscribe there. I'm trying to build a subscriber base up there as well. If you would, please. Pretty please, as a command, as asking for it. And as also I'm on Twitter, Church Controversy. I think it's Controversies 8 at Controversies H is the handle there. If you want to go find us there. And if you are so inclined, we also have a Patreon account where you can become a patron of the podcast. So, welcome again to another review episode of Controversies in Church History. This time on a film most of you are probably familiar with. This is one of the great movies about a Catholic figure. Virtually every serious Catholic I know loves this film. It's A Man for All Seasons, the film about St. Thomas More, who was executed for defying Henry VIII during the English Reformation. This episode of review, the last ones have been me reading written versions of reviews of shows. This one will not be. I've never actually done one on A Man for All Seasons, even though I'm an historian. I'm trained in early modern English history. It's not exactly my wheelhouse. The 17th century is more my wheelhouse, but I know about the period very well from graduate study. And I just never did one, partly because it's so obvious, maybe because there's so many takes out there. But I figured I'd do this one, give you guys an episode where I talked about A Man for All Seasons, a movie that won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor. Paul Scofield, we'll talk about him in a second. And probably the last Hollywood film about a Catholic character, an Orthodox one, an admirable one, to win the Best Picture Oscar, I think. Hasn't been any sense that I could. Well, maybe one exception. I'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, this is of course the film everyone loves. If you don't know the story, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably know the story of Sir Thomas More. Of course, he was a famous humanist and lawyer, famous author of Utopia, a sort of philosophical work on an ideal society, friend of Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, the other Dutch humanist of the age, skillful statesman, becomes Lord Chancellor under Henry VIII. But when Henry VIII wants to divorce Catherine of Aragon, so he can marry one of his courtiers, ladies at court, Anne Boleyn, More refuses to accede to the marriage. He resigns, but Henry VIII wants total sort of submission from his people in his court, and even though he's no longer there, he tries to get it from him. Eventually, he winds up arresting him on specious pretenses, and eventually gets him condemned on specious pretenses, and so he is martyred for the faith. In 1535. So the basic story is pretty straightforward. We're going to delve into some of that, but a few things about More here. But if you don't know, I want to focus on the actual film, which if you don't know was actually based on a play by Robert Bolt. Excuse me, no, he wasn't knighted. Robert Bolt was a playwright who also wrote several screenplays. He wrote a play called A Man for All Seasons, which you don't know if it's taken from a quotation of a contemporary that More was a man for all seasons. Someone who was Renaissance man, who could do a lot of things, and so the background of this is More as this figure of conscience, and that's kind of what makes the film famous. If you don't know, the director of A Man for All Seasons is a man named Fred Zinnemann. Fred Zinnemann was an Austrian but Jewish by background, And he was a famous director. He won 2 Academy Awards for as Best Director, one for A Man for All Seasons, another one for From Here to Eternity in 1953. He also directed High Noon with Gary Cooper. So this is a big-time director who directed this. And interesting background because he was Austrian, but he immigrated to the United States because of World War II. And both of his parents died in the Holocaust. And he tended to choose, apparently, films or stories to film that were about conscience, about people standing up to, hostile forces. That's kind of what High Noon is about. That's kind of a little bit what From Here to Eternity is about. And that's kind of definitely what the play and the film, A Man for All Seasons, is about as well. Because I mentioned Robert Bolt, if you don't know, was not a Christian really. Was raised Methodist, that kind of lost his faith. But did a couple of major Catholic films. Another one I may have to review later on is The Mission. He wrote the screenplay for that as well. But in A Man for All Seasons, last time I did one of these, I talked about the Tudors and talked about some of the problems with it historically speaking, but what things I liked about it. And in these historical films, there's always some reason. Even when you write a historical novel, or something like that, you go back to the past partly because you think you admire the person there. But if you're doing something like this, you're always using it for your own purposes, for something in the present. And Bolt is a case in point with this, because if you don't know, in the film, you've probably seen YouTube clips of the famous trial scene where Bolt actually took excerpts from Moore's son-in-law, William Roper, his account of the trial, and he actually speaks a lot of the words in those scenes. But Bolt was pretty self-conscious about using Moore for his own purposes. Bolt was kind of into existentialism in the 1960s. This is a big thing in the 1960s. And he makes him into very much a sort of modern martyr for modern sense of self, modern sense of individuality. There's a scene in the film and in the play where Thomas More is trying to convince the Duke of Norfolk that he's not crazy. Everybody thinks he's crazy. And by the way, that was actually fairly true. A lot of people thought he was being obstinate at the time because everyone else was taking the oath, right? It seemed to be, part of God's will that you would obey your appointed leaders. So it seemed, out of the ordinary that he'd do this. And in that scene in the film and in the play, he says to the Duke of Norfolk, Moore does, "It's not important that I believe it, but that I believe it," with the emphasis on the I. And in fact, in the play, the I is italicized. And that's because Bolt was into this stuff. And he knew, by the way, self-consciously he was doing that. He knew the real Moore was not like that. In fact, I'm going to read a passage here. This is actually from the preface to the published edition of the play version of this. And it's worth quoting because it's so interesting. He basically makes an apology for why he does this. Because he said, this guy's an Orthodox Catholic. This is kind of a different thing. This is what he says. This is why he did this. This is him saying why he used Moore as a conveyance for his own beliefs. He says, "For this reason, a man takes an oath only when he wants to commit himself quite exceptionally to the statement, when he wants to make an identity between the truth of it and his own virtue. He offers himself as a guarantee, and it works. There is a special kind of shrug for a perjurer. We feel that the man has no self to commit, no guarantee to offer. Of course, it's much less effective now that for us most of the actual words of the oath are not much more than impressive mumbo-jumbo than it was when they were made obvious sense. We would prefer most men to guarantee their statements with, say, cash rather than with themselves. We feel, we know, the self to be an equivocal commodity. There are fewer and fewer things which, as they say, we, quote, unquote, cannot bring ourselves to do. We can find almost no limits for ourselves other than the physical, which, being physical, are not optional. Perhaps this is why we have fallen back so widely on physical torture as a means of bringing pressure to bear on one another. But though few of us have anything in ourselves like an immortal soul, which we regard as absolutely inviolable, yet most of us still feel something which we should prefer, on the whole, not to violate. Most men feel when they swear an oath, the marriage vow for example, that they've invested something. And from this it's possible to guess what an oath must be to a man for whom it is not merely a time-honored and understood ritual, but also a definite contract. It may be that a clear sense of the self can only crystallize around something transcendental in which case our prospects look poor, for we are rightly committed to the rational. I think the paramount gift our thinkers, artists, and for all I know, our men of science, should labor to get for us is a sense of selfhood without resort to magic. Albert Camus is a writer I admire in this connection. Anyway, the above must serve as my explanation and apology for treating Thomas More, a Christian saint, as a hero of selfhood, unquote. Lots of things to talk about there, one of which is that he's speaking for us. He means people who obviously aren't religious anymore. But interestingly, he identifies the idea that he wants to find some sort of self there, right? This is what he admires about More and other figures. They don't seem to bend before power like that. But he also, if you notice that one quote there, he says, well, I want to try it. It seems to require something transcendental. And if that's the case, then we're in a bad way. I think he hit on something very, very obvious there and very actually astute. But he was using More for his own purposes in the film. And again, like I didn't mention this in the review of The Tudors, like any film of that kind, it's going to take liberties. And the play and the film take liberties, the screenplay and the play. But actually, Bolt's pretty good about giving the real More some time in the play, in the movie as well. One of my favorite scenes in the story is when early on in the film he goes to see Cardinal Wolsey, played wonderfully by Orson Welles, a very rotund Orson Welles at that point in his life, and he's telling him we need to sanction the divorce so we can get an heir, and he says to More, what are you going to do? Pray for a miracle? And then More says, there are precedents. And that's a wonderful phrase. And wonderful because it captures the real More perfectly. His piety, his real belief in miracles, but also his legal training, right? He's, common law thinking is precedent-based, if you don't know English common law. And so he naturally replies in that vein. It's a really nice scene. He also comes out, of course, in the final speech at the end, the trial. There he's, given lines, like I said before, from his son-in-law's version of his speech. And so you get some of the real More coming through. But a lot of ways in this film, you're getting an existentialist anti-hero. If you didn't know that watching the film, you are. It's very much in that vein. That's probably, again, why Fred Zinnemann was attracted to the story. Partly what makes it accessible to so many people who aren't Catholic, because it's not really, it may look that way, but it's not really meant to celebrate his Catholicism. Even though it kind of does. This is the good thing about the film, why it's so much better than a lot of these other things I've gone through. And I'll go to some other ones that are really bad, despite the fact it does put words in his mouth that would never have been there. I mean, he says that the idea, to give you the contrast, he's not only Catholic, he really, really believes in the communal nature of truth. One of his biographers, Peter Ackroyd, years ago mentioned this, that truth for Thomas More was something public. It was something known. It was something debatable. It wasn't something private. It wasn't a matter of private intuition. And that's why he was so horrified by the Reformation. He thought they were just appealing to, what we call private judgment. And so he never would have said those things. But a really good screenwriter, playwright like Bolt is, will still allow the real More to come through, even though it definitely is set in this way. That it's he's an existentialist anti-hero in a lot of ways. Wonderful performances, of course, to turn to the film. We'll get to More himself in a second. A few thoughts on him. I mentioned Orson Welles, who plays Wolsey. There's some other major names in here. John Hurt, who would later go on to fame for a lot of things, but mostly famous for having an alien jump out of his chest in the film Alien, and later in the 1970s. Susanna York plays his daughter, Margaret, and Susanna York didn't have a great career, but if you know anything, well, she had a great career. She had a career, but beautiful English lady. If you ever see her in anything, probably, I'm dating myself here. She was in Superman 2, the original Richard Donner Superman films of the late 70s. In the original film, they had Marlon Brando playing oh boy, whatever Superman's father, Kal-El's father, Jor-El. There you go. In this sort of little machine in his whatever Fortress of Solitude. In the second film, they couldn't get him back or whatever. They didn't pay him enough. So Susanna York plays his mother. She plays his mother in the first film too, and so you see her there. Went on to some fame there. You probably don't know most of these people. If you don't like British television or British film, you won't know most of these actors. Another one I love in this film is Leo McKern. Leo McKern's actually an Australian actor. Also, by the way, someone with, if you watch the film, his eyes look kind of funny. He also had a glass eye. But Leo McKern plays Thomas Cromwell, the man who gets Thomas More convicted in the film. And he's portrayed, and his portrayal in this is kind of, and again, most of the characters are kind of a little bit exaggerated. Wolsey, you could say he was corrupt. He wasn't quite the cynical person that he's portrayed in the play and in the film. Cromwell, a little different as well. Like he was ruthless. He was a Machiavellian in that sense, but they make him almost this sort of, irreligious figure who's just out to get power. He was actually a genuine Protestant. He believed in Lutheran ideas. It's one of the things they kind of get wrong in the film. But McKern's performance is great. Devious, kind of almost a little bit like impish. Leo McKern, a nice career. Anything else you've seen you might recommend? I actually may do a review of this one, but he was in one Catholic film later. I don't know if he was Catholic later in his life, but I don't know how to pronounce this. I'll get it wrong, but the film Molokai, or Molokai, which if you don't know is a biopic of Saint Damien of Molokai. This is the Belgian priest who contracted Hansen's disease. It used to be known as leprosy. It's not quite accurate, but out in Hawaii and died there. In the leper colony, well, I just said it, in the colony for those people out there. And it's a secular, made by a secular company. It's very good. I recommend it. There's one, I'll get to that. I'll actually get to that. But he plays in that film. He plays Damien's bishop, and so fine actor. Highly recommend looking into him. And a few others here. The main star of the film, of course, is Paul Scofield. Wonderful actor. Won the Academy Award for best actor for this film. Someone who was mostly a stage actor, came from the stage. He won a Tony Award for his role. He played in the play version of it first. He was the man who originated it. And again, won the Academy Award for it as well. Went on to do a few other things, a few American films you might recognize, or maybe not. He did the film version of The Crucible in 1996, if I'm not mistaken. He's also played in a film version of Hamlet, in which Mel Gibson was playing Hamlet. He plays his father's ghost in that. But Scofield was a fantastic actor. And this film itself is kind of interestingly in the time it came out in. I mentioned 1966, kind of last of these, I don't want to say the last of these, but I mentioned the last time a Catholic figure like this would get a film about him, would actually win an Academy Award. I remember reading somewhere that it was kind of like one of the last great sort of historical costume dramas that they used to dominate the Oscars. It won this in 1966. 3 years later, there was another film about the same period called Anne of a Thousand Days. It was about Anne Boleyn. Richard Burton was the star at that time. He was in it, and it lost out to Midnight Cowboy, which, if you don't know, is a sort of very 1960s film. Had sort of risque content in it, and it sort of marked a changing culturally of the guard there. It's not true that movies like this, historical films, don't tend to. They sometimes win Best Picture. I believe a few years ago, 12 Years a Slave, about a man who was kidnapped into slavery from the north and sold into slavery in the south. Black man. Years ago, what was the King's Speech? And that's one. The two that come to mind that are definitely more like this are Gladiator, which won it back in 2000. That's Ridley Scott, our old friend Ridley Scott, and Mel Gibson. Braveheart won it in 1995. There's a couple others, but they tend to shy away from those things anymore, and especially this type of film where it treats a historical figure this reverentially. Especially, I hate to say this, if he's Western European. Some of those films I've mentioned, 12 Years a Slave, it's obviously not about, well, they have them in there, but it's not really about that. A couple other ones, Gandhi, obviously one that's not about that, non-Western culture. The Last Emperor, which was about the last Chinese emperor, obviously a different thing, won Best Picture, those sorts of things. So this is kind of a relic from an earlier time period, when those things were sort of allowed culturally by the powers that be. And about Moore himself, just a few more things about him, just to talk about the film and who he was in real life. Again, it gets some of the his Catholic nature in there. At one point in the film, he mentions to his his son-in-law, William Roper, was, toying with Lutheran ideas, and he says to him, well, Luther's a heretic, and his son objects, and he says, doesn't like that word, and he says, well, it's not a likable word, it's not a likable thing. They don't actually get how involved More was with trying to suppress heresy in the years before he was actually, while he was still Chancellor of England. That was his position under Henry VIII. He actually put him in charge of it, and that actually was a shift, because before this, it had only ever been clerics who'd ever investigated people for theological crimes. And it's actually part of Henry VIII's efforts to sort of, take over the church, basically. It's putting a layman in charge of this, putting a layman in charge of the government. Clerics had played that role for a long time in medieval life, and so, More went along with this because he was hoping to bend, Henry VIII, get him away from what he was doing, and didn't work. And wound up having to go to the scaffold because of it. But interesting thing. A couple other things, if you don't know about Thomas More's thing about his life, and it's kind of hard to talk about it in a short little episode like this because it's such a vanished world. He was actually born in London. I'm not exactly sure, sometime in 1478. It's 1477, 1478. But he was born effectively in the same on the same street, Milk Street in London, as had been Thomas Becket in the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Becket in the Middle Ages. So fascinating. He's growing basically like one block away or something like that, like right near it. So fascinating thing about this. And he is the kind of person, was more, as I mentioned, would be more involved in, he took, heresy seriously. On his tombstone, I believe, again, his biographer, Peter Ackroyd, actually said he had used the word molesta. He was molestas to heretics. I can't remember what the Latin translation is, but he was an opponent of heresy, and so it was something he was actually kind of proud of. Gets left out of this, obviously, because of the nature of the film. But you have all this in the background, and the film is still good. It still has some sensibility there that appreciates More's Catholicism and brings that to the fore, even though it's, again, in the service of Bolt's idea that he's, this sort of existentialist anti-hero. I'm thinking about it. I have my copy of A Man for All Seasons in front of me, the film itself. Forgot about one other performance to mention. Robert Shaw, the great Scottish actor, most famously for Jaws, probably if you're an American, plays Henry VIII with some real verve and real energy in the film. He only has, I think, one scene, but it's where he goes to Chelsea, he goes to Moore's house and tries to get him to change his mind about the marriage. He refuses, and he kind of is alternatively flattering and threatening. Does a really nice job with it. So you have all of these sorts of elements in the film that make it, it's a great film, obviously, classic film, but also has some authenticity to it. On the other hand, as I mentioned, there are certain liberties they take. I mentioned, the big thing is the existentialist aspects of the film, the play. Another thing that's kind of related to that is the nature of Henry VIII's persecution. You have this nice scene where, Thomas More, Howard. This is right after More is in the film. He's given up his office, and the Duke of Norfolk, Howard, his friend, is trying to get him to explain why, and he says, "Well, I'm afraid," at one point, and then Howard goes, "Man, you're ill. This isn't Spain, This is England." And the implication there, that phrase, this isn't the place where they have the Spanish Inquisition, because the Spanish Inquisition is going around spying on people and then getting them executed and all this stuff. And there's another scene later on, nice scene where, again, Liam McKern as Thomas Cromwell is trying to get Howard, Duke of Norfolk, to convince More to publicly approve of the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. And Howard basically refuses, and then Cromwell says, "You better." And he says, "Are you threatening me?" And then Cromwell goes, "My dear Norfolk, this isn't Spain. This is England," insinuating that he's been spying on him. And it's a nice little dance they do, but it's it's fictional. The Spanish Inquisition, I have to do another one. I've done an episode on this. Was a court, and yeah, you could be denounced to it, but it didn't have spies everywhere. That was pretty silly. And Henry VIII, again, pretty ruthless, brutal government, but I think he's conflated. I think what he's thinking about there, Bolt was and Zinnemann. They're thinking about modern totalitarian states. They think about the Nazis. They think about fascism. Mentioned Zinnemann's history with the Holocaust, and that's certainly, this is 1966. It's right dead in the middle of the Cold War. It's kind of on people's minds, and so I think that's where this stuff sort of comes from. So it's another aspect of the film's kind of overdone. Other aspects they get wrong. This is something I mentioned, I think, on the Tudors, the episode on the Tudors, perhaps, definitely in the episode on Rome. You see Thomas More in the film. He has his daughter Meg, he has his wife Alice, and that's it. And of course, he had a bunch of people living under his house, family, like a couple generations. I think eventually you had, Roper and Margaret Moore and their children, but they had several generations of people living under the same roof. He was a great man. He had a big family, and it's kind of funny. There's a scene in the film where he dismisses his servants, and he has like 50 servants, and he's only got three family members in his household. He might have had that many servants. He definitely would have had more family in there, but they can only have so many characters on screen or in a play, so they have to take that stuff out. Those types of things you kind of generally have to do in a play or a film like this. Some other things interesting are the differences, by the way, between the play and the actual film. One of the biggest differences is that in the play, there aren't many differences, by the way. One of the biggest ones is there's a character in the play version. His name's like the Common Man. Whoops, sorry. I hit something there. Common Man. He sort of talks directly to the audience and then merges into another character, like someone who's talking to other characters in the film. And he sort of gives you these monologues. And it's meant to be a pretty clear distinction between the Common Man and someone like Thomas More, who's this upright figure. The Common Man's only concerned about his self-interest, and like it's meant to be this sort of almost sort of satirical, but almost kind of cynical play on all this stuff. And the play actually ends with him talking to the audience in the play. It doesn't get into the film; it's totally cut. There's also one major figure who doesn't make it into the film, and that's Eustacio Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, the Spanish ambassador. Who I mentioned him in my review of the Tudors, how I like that character in that film. It's one of the worst aspects of the play, to be honest. It kind of plays on anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish English stereotypes. Chapuis is a religious hypocrite. He's kind of, conniving. He makes him sound like a bad guy, and I don't think that was actually fair to Chapuis. So glad they cut it from the film anyway. So you have these certain things that they did differently. Most part, it's the same, more or less the same film, definitely the same dialogue, most of the same dialogue. But interesting what they did differently for the film as opposed to the play. And finally, just a few concluding thoughts on Moore and on the film. Again, thinking about, it's 1966. This is it's 57 years ago that film came out. It's amazing. And it only came out, man, I'm old. It only came out 12 years before I was born, in 1978. And so much change between then and now and in our society. I doubt this film could be made today. I just don't think you could make a film that was this positive about a figure like this. I mentioned it before. There haven't been many films like this. I mentioned Ridley Scott, who I have to give at least some credit to. Like, he won an Academy Award in the year 2000 with a movie about a white European, and won the Oscar. Definitely couldn't do that today. That's 20 years ago. So, but just thinking about the portrayal of Moore, because he had been seen like throughout most of history, like since his death, he'd been admired by pretty much everybody. Protestant and Catholic. Everybody wanted to claim some sort of connection to him. And in the last, it was 10, 15 years ago, you probably don't know this, especially if you're an American, one of the first real negative treatments of him that has ever become popular was a series of novels called Wolf Hall. And God, I'm blanking on the name of the author. She just passed away, actually. Oh, boy. Anyway, they actually fictionalized the events of Henry VIII's reign through the eyes of Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell, the fixer who gets, who who uses perjured evidence to get Thomas More convicted and executed, is portrayed as the hero of all this, if you can imagine. And she has a real nasty dislike of Thomas More, and portrays him as a fanatic, portrays him as someone who's sexually repressed. She insinuates that he has sexual desires for his daughter and all this stuff. And it's just amazing. And by the way, she was raised Catholic, naturally. God, I can't remember her name. You'll kill me on the comments for this. I can't remember this off the top of my head. Blanking. But if you want to read a good takedown, by the way, of that author, who's, I can't believe I'm forgetting her name. There's one, you can find it on YouTube, actually. It's also in written form somewhere if you Google it. Richard Rex, who was a Cambridge historian, practicing Catholic, I think fairly Orthodox from what I understand, gave a talk somewhere, I can't remember what it was, a couple of years ago, and did a major takedown of her version of Thomas More. And basically he made the point that you almost had to do that if you're going to write a novel about Thomas Cromwell, because nobody ever made Thomas Cromwell a hero of anything before. So it's kind of interesting the changes that have happened that you would have in our modern secularized society to actually turn him into a villain, in which only in this era could you do that. Never been done before. Kind of a good measure of how things have changed in the last half century or so. And finally, just one last reflection about Thomas More. I actually took my baptismal, my confirmation saint name was Thomas More. I took his name for that, and I always admired him. Even before I became Catholic. Someone you look up to. You go to graduate school. You're intellectually inclined. You look at this intellectual figure. He wrote a famous book. He was learned. He was successful, and he was also, of course, a martyr. He made himself a martyr for the faith. And I think the years have gone on, and what I admire most about Thomas More is probably his willingness to not just the death, but putting off all of the. He put off all the success he had. He lost his he didn't lose all of it, but he lost his status. He lost all those sorts of things. That's in some ways almost harder for people to give up than their life. Most people loathe giving up any sort of loss of status or loss of power that way, and he did both of those things willingly. And I think again, despite the fact that it is sort of directed in an ideological way toward ideas he wouldn't have favored. This is why the film kind of endures in a lot of ways. Again. It's very old-fashioned, by the way. It's very definitely filmed in an older style, but still holds up after all these years, partly because of the man himself. And again, this is one of the things where even if you at least try to do it well, Hollywood couldn't ruin even back then, but it wouldn't even be attempted today. So that is my little review of A Man for All Seasons. A little bit rambling, but I hope you'll share my thoughts with you and what I thought about it. Just a few quick updates on what's coming. I know I've been promising some new stuff. It's coming. The next new one's actually coming for my patrons. The next episode for the series on the Latinization of the Eastern Rites is almost ready. It'll be done probably Monday-ish. Maybe Monday or Tuesday it'll drop. That's coming. The next one after that's for everyone it's behind. I'm behind on it. That'll be the one on the Pearson Integrated Humanities program, which you should definitely listen to. Got writing projects going on. I've actually finished an historical novel. I've been looking around, trying to find an agent. So please keep that in your prayers if you would. And other things. I'm finishing another nonfiction book as well. So that's why this is taking longer. And I don't have any teaching during the summer, so I want to get that as much writing as I can. But it's coming. As are at some point interviews. I keep saying it. They're coming. I'm trying to nail down people. I'm also still worried about my internet, which is this rural internet service that I have. It's not that great. So satellite internet, I mean. So I live in a rural area now. And again, some new things are coming, I promise. But it's going to. You see, I'm not exactly on the ball here. I apologize for that. But new things are coming, new episodes are coming, new content's coming, so be on the lookout for that. And so, once again, go like and subscribe. Podcast, wherever you listen. Like our Facebook page. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Visit the website. Should have a new article coming out from Crisis soon. And I think it's on the traditionalist movement again, although it's not really about them. It's kind of about that. You'll see. And yes, and if you want to be a patron, please go to Patreon. The benefit of that is you're going to get bonus episodes, just a couple there. You'll get episodes earlier. You also get them without ads. You get ads in the podcast, or one ad anyway. So, but if you want to do that, by all means. But mostly, again, thank everyone for listening. Thank you for your support in any way, shape, or form. Your prayers. Keep me in your prayers. I pray for you guys, my listeners. So, and everyone have a wonderful week. Have a great. I don't know if you're on the old rite, it's still the octave of Pentecost. If you're not, it's not. But have a wonderful, wonderful week, and hopefully you guys will be hearing from me soon. Take care and God bless.